The cowboy's hammer rang against the nails like a church bell calling nobody to prayer. And Thomas Nolan figured that sound would be his only companion for the rest of his days. He was 28 years old in the spring of 1876, and the cabin he was building in the Wyoming Territory near White River stood half-finished, a skeleton of timber and stone that he told himself would one day be a home. But home for who? Just him, he reckoned, as he had for the past 3 years since he'd claimed this land. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, golden grasses rippling like water under a sky so blue it hurt to look at for too long. He drove another nail home, wiped the sweat from his brow, and told himself this was enough. A man didn't need more than his own company, his own 2 hands, and honest work. He had been telling himself that lie for so long he almost believed it. The sound of wagon wheels grinding against dry earth pulled Thomas from his thoughts. He turned, hammer still in hand, and squinted against the afternoon sun. A covered wagon lurched along the rough trail that passed a quarter-mile from his property, moving slower than it should. Even from this distance, he could see something was wrong. The wagon listed to one side, and the horses pulling it looked exhausted, their heads hanging low. Thomas set down his hammer and walked toward the trail, his long legs covering ground quickly. As he got closer, he could make out a figure on the driver's bench, slumped forward in a way that made his chest tighten with concern. By the time he reached the trail, the wagon had come to a complete stop, and the horses stood there trembling with fatigue. Thomas approached carefully, calling out so as not to startle anyone. "Hello there, you folks need help?" No answer came. He moved around to the side of the wagon and looked up at the driver's bench. A woman sat there, her face pale as milk, her dark hair coming loose from its pins. Her eyes were closed, and for a terrible moment, Thomas thought she might be dead. Then her eyelids fluttered, and she looked down at him with eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. "Please," she whispered, and then she started to fall. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground, his arms coming up instinctively. She weighed next to nothing, and up close he could see she was burning with fever. Her dress was dusty from travel, and when he shifted his hold on her, she made a small sound of pain. "Easy now," he said softly. "I've got you." He looked into the back of the wagon and saw her belongings, modest and few. A trunk, some cooking supplies, blankets. No one else. She was traveling alone, which in this country was either very brave or very desperate. Thomas carried her back to his half-built cabin, his mind racing. He had a bedroll inside the completed portion, and he laid her down as gently as he could. She was conscious, but barely, her eyes glassy with fever. He fetched water from his well and a clean cloth, then knelt beside her and pressed the cool fabric to her forehead. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. "Emma," she managed, her voice hoarse. "Emma Anderson." "I'm Thomas Nolan. You're safe now, Miss Anderson. When did you last eat or drink?" "Yesterday morning, I think." She tried to sit up and fell back with a gasp. "My wagon, the horses. I'll take care of them. You just rest." Thomas gave her water, helping her drink slowly so she wouldn't be sick. Then he went back out to tend to her horses, unhitching them and leading them to his small corral. They drank deeply from the trough, and he gave them grain from his own stores. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He pulled Emma's wagon closer to his cabin, though it took considerable effort with the broken wheel he discovered. That would need fixing. Inside the wagon, he found her trunk and carried it inside. She would need her things. Emma was asleep when he returned, her breathing shallow but steady. Thomas built up his fire and put coffee on to boil, then set about making a simple stew with salt pork and beans. While it cooked, he studied the woman who had literally fallen into his life. She was beautiful, even in her current state. Her face had good bones, as his mother would have said, strong and graceful at once. Her hands, resting on the blanket he'd covered her with, were small but showed signs of work. Not a pampered lady then, but someone who knew about labor. He found himself wondering what had brought her out here alone, where she had been going, whether anyone was waiting for her. The stew was ready after an hour, and Thomas managed to wake Emma enough to get some food into her. She ate only a little before exhaustion claimed her again, but it was enough to ease his worry. He sat by the fire and ate his own portion, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and the soft breathing of the stranger who now occupied his home. This wasn't how he had imagined this day would go. This morning, his future had been certain, solitary, mapped out in timber and stone. Now there was a woman sleeping in his cabin, and Thomas found that his carefully constructed solitude felt less like peace and more like loneliness. He spent the night in his barn with the horses, giving Emma privacy. Sleep came in fits and starts, and when dawn broke, he was already up and moving. Inside the cabin, Emma still slept, but her color looked better. Thomas made breakfast, and the smell of frying bacon finally woke her. She sat up slowly, looking around with confusion that cleared into recognition when she saw him. "You're the man from yesterday," she said. "The one who caught me." "Thomas Nolan, madam, how are you feeling?" Emma took stock of herself, touching her forehead gingerly. "Better, weak, but better." She looked down at the blanket covering her, then around at the cabin. "You brought me here, took care of me. Couldn't very well leave you in that wagon. You had a bad fever." Thomas brought her a plate of food and a cup of coffee. "Think you can eat? I can try." She took the plate, and Thomas noticed her hands were steadier this morning. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "Where were you heading, if you don't mind my asking?" Emma was quiet for a moment, her eyes on her food. "West. California, maybe. Or just away." She looked up at him, and there was something fierce and sad in her expression. "I was running from a marriage I didn't want. My father arranged it to settle his debts. I couldn't do it, so I left, took what little I had and ran." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of admiration and protectiveness. "That took courage, or foolishness." Emma managed a small smile. "I clearly didn't plan well enough. I fell ill 3 days ago, and I just kept pushing on. I thought if I could make it to the next town, I could rest. But I ran out of strength." "Well, you can rest here as long as you need. I don't have much, but what I have is yours." The words came out easily, naturally, and Thomas meant them. There was something about this woman that called to him, something beyond her beauty. Maybe it was the courage it took to choose freedom over security, or maybe it was just the simple human need to help someone in distress. Emma spent the next 3 days recovering her strength. Thomas continued work on his cabin during the day, but he found himself taking more breaks than usual, coming in to check on her, to bring her water or food, to simply talk. She was easy to talk to, with a quick mind and a gentle sense of humor that surprised him. She told him about her life in Ohio, about the father who had loved cards more than his daughter, about the sisters she had left behind with promises to send for them when she could. Thomas found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken about in years. About his own parents, lost to cholera when he was 17. About his time as a ranch hand, saving every penny. About his dream of building something of his own, something that would last. "It's a good dream," Emma said on the 3rd evening. They were sitting outside watching the sunset, Emma wrapped in a blanket though the air was warm. "Building something that matters. I thought so, but I was building it just for me. A man and his pride, that's all it was." Thomas picked up a piece of grass and twisted it between his fingers. "Seeing you here, though, it made me realize how empty it all felt. What's the point of building a future if you've got no one to share it with?" Emma turned to look at him, and in the golden light of dusk her eyes seemed to glow. "Maybe you won't always be alone. Maybe not." Thomas held her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, something fragile and new and full of possibility. By the end of the week, Emma was well enough to move around freely. She insisted on helping with chores, despite Thomas's protests. He watched her hang laundry on the line he strung up, watched her tend to the small garden plot he had started, watched her move through his space like she belonged there. And maybe she did. The cabin seemed more like a home with her in it, warmer somehow despite the summer heat. Thomas found himself building with new purpose. The walls went up faster, the roof took shape, and every nail he drove was driven with the thought that he wasn't building for one anymore. Emma noticed, of course. She was too clever not to. One afternoon, she brought him water while he worked on framing a window, and she said, "You've been working differently." "How so?" More carefully. "Like it matters more now." She smiled, handing him the dipper. "Am I wrong?" Thomas drank, using the moment to gather his thoughts. "No, you're not wrong. Emma, I know you've only been here a short time, and I know you had plans to move on, but I need to say something." He set down the dipper and turned to face her fully. "I'd like you to stay, not as a guest, not out of obligation, but because I want you here. Because in a week, you've made me feel more alive than I have in 3 years. Because when I look at this cabin now, I see it as a home, and I see you in it." Emma's eyes widened, and for a moment, Thomas feared he had overstepped. Then she smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I'd like to stay, Thomas. I was dreading the day you'd tell me I was well enough to leave. I've never felt safer or more at peace than I have here with you." "Then stay." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his large calloused palm engulfing her smaller one. "Help me build this. Not for me, not for you, but for us." "Us," Emma repeated, testing the word. I like the sound of that. The days that followed were some of the happiest Thomas had ever known. He and Emma fell into a rhythm, working side by side during the day and sitting together by the fire in the evenings. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories, habits, and dreams. Thomas discovered that Emma loved to sing while she worked, old hymns and folk songs that floated across the prairie like birdsong. Emma learned that Thomas was a man of few words but deep feelings, that he showed his care through actions rather than speeches. He fixed her wagon wheel without being asked. He built her a proper washstand. He brought her wildflowers and pretended not to see the way her eyes lit up. 3 weeks after Emma's arrival, Thomas rode into White River, the nearest town, some 15 miles east. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed to think. His feelings for Emma had grown stronger every day, deeper than anything he had experienced before. He was falling in love with her, if he was honest, had probably been falling since the moment he caught her in his arms. But what right did he have to ask her for more? She had just escaped one forced marriage. The last thing she probably wanted was another man making claims on her heart. White River was a small town, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street. Thomas conducted his business at the general store, buying flour, sugar, coffee, and fabric for Emma to make new dresses if she wanted. The shopkeeper, a woman named Mrs. Henley, gave him a knowing look. "Heard you had company out at your place," she said. The woman who came through sick. News traveled fast in small communities. "She's staying on to help with the homestead," Thomas said, keeping his voice neutral. "Is that so?" Mrs. Henley smiled. "Well, a man does need a wife if he's going to make a go of it out here. No shame in that." Thomas felt his ears grow hot. "We're not married, madam." "Not yet, maybe." Mrs. Henley wrapped his purchases in brown paper. "But I recognize that look in a man's eyes. You're smitten, Mr. Nolan. And from what I heard, she could do far worse than a hard-working man with his own land." Thomas left the store feeling unsettled but not displeased. Was it really so obvious? And if it was, did Emma see it too? He made one more stop before leaving town, at the small office of the circuit judge who came through once a month. He didn't speak to the man, just noted when he would next be in White River, just in case. When Thomas returned home that evening, the sun was setting and Emma was outside, standing near the half-completed cabin with her hand shading her eyes as she watched for him. Something about the sight made his heart clench. She was watching for him, waiting for him. When he pulled up in the wagon, she hurried over with a smile that made the long ride worth it. "You were gone so long I started to worry," she said, helping him unload supplies. "Just took my time. Got you something." Thomas pulled out the fabric, a soft blue cotton that matched her eyes. Emma took it, running her fingers over the material with wonder. "Thomas, this is too fine. You shouldn't have. You need a new dress. Your others are worn thin from travel." He carried the supplies inside, feeling pleased with himself. "Besides, I wanted to." That night after dinner, Emma sat mending one of Thomas's shirts while he oiled his saddle. The domestic simplicity of the scene struck them both. Emma paused in her stitching and said, "Thomas, what are we doing?" He looked up, confused. "I'm working on my saddle and you're mending." "No, I mean, what are we doing? You and me. This." She gestured around them. "I'm living in your home, eating your food, acting like a wife, but without any of the security or respectability that comes with marriage. If anyone found out, it would ruin both our reputations." Thomas set down his work. "Do you want to leave?" "No." The answer came quickly, firmly. "No, I don't, but I also don't want to presume anything. You saved my life, Thomas, and I'm grateful, but I don't want you to feel obligated to me out of pity or duty. Obligated." Thomas stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. "Emma, everything I do because I want to. Because having you here has made me happier than I knew I could be. Because when I think about the future now, you're in every single picture in my head." He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I love you. I know it's fast, I know it's crazy, but it's true. I love you and I want to build this life with you properly, as my wife if you'll have me." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You love me with everything I have." "Then yes." She cupped his face with both hands. "Yes, Thomas, I'll marry you. I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you the first time I woke up and saw you making breakfast, trying so hard to be quiet so you wouldn't disturb me. You're the best man I've ever known." Thomas kissed her then, a gentle, reverent kiss that sealed their promise. When they pulled apart, both were grinning like fools. "The circuit judge will be in White River in 2 weeks, Thomas said. We can be married then. 2 weeks. Emma laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I'm going to be Emma Nolan. That all right with you?" "It's more than all right. It's perfect." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Thomas worked harder than ever, determined to have at least the main room of the cabin fully finished before the wedding. Emma sewed her new dress and helped with everything she could, from chinking gaps in the walls to whitewashing the interior. They worked together like a team, and every evening they sat outside and planned their future. They would add rooms as children came, Thomas said. They would plant a bigger garden, maybe get some chickens, eventually cattle. Emma talked about sending for her sisters once they were more established, giving them a safe place to come to. Thomas agreed immediately. Family mattered. Home mattered. The day before the wedding, Thomas rode into White River to confirm arrangements with the judge and to pick up a few final supplies. When he returned, Emma was wearing her new blue dress, and the sight of her took his breath away. She had put her hair up in a style he hadn't seen before, elegant and soft, and in the evening light she looked like something from a dream. "You're beautiful," he said, almost dumbfounded. Emma blushed, pleased. I wanted to make sure the dress fit properly. We can't have me looking like a scarecrow at my own wedding. You could never look like a scarecrow. Thomas dismounted and went to her, taking her hands. Emma, I want you to know that tomorrow, when I make my vows, I'll mean every word. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes to me. I know you will. That's why I said yes. Emma squeezed his hands. I never thought I'd find this, Thomas. Real love with a good man. I thought I'd spend my whole life running or hiding, but you made me want to stay. You made me want to build a life, not just survive. They spent their last evening as an unmarried couple, talking late into the night, sharing hopes and fears, making promises that went beyond the formal vows they would speak the next day. When they finally parted to sleep, Thomas in the barn and Emma in the cabin, both felt the sweet anticipation of what was to come. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. Thomas dressed in his best clothes, a dark suit he had kept carefully packed since leaving his last job. He rode into town early, his stomach tight with nervous excitement. Emma would come later with Mrs. Henley, who had kindly offered to stand as witness and to help Emma prepare. The judge's office was small but clean, and Judge Warner himself was a kindly man in his 60s who seemed genuinely pleased to be performing the ceremony. When Emma arrived, Thomas felt his chest constrict. She was radiant, her blue dress perfect, her hair adorned with wildflowers she must have picked that morning. Mrs. Henley beamed beside her, clearly delighted to be part of the occasion. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Thomas spoke his vows in a steady voice, promising to love, honor, and cherish Emma for the rest of his days. Emma's voice shook slightly with emotion as she made her own promises, but her eyes never left his, and the love shining in them was unmistakable. When Judge Warner pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Emma with all the tenderness and passion he felt, not caring that the judge and Mrs. Henley were watching. This was his wife, his partner, his future. Emma kissed him back with equal fervor, and when they broke apart, both were smiling through tears. Mrs. Henley insisted they come to the hotel for a wedding meal, and she wouldn't take no for an answer. She had arranged everything, she said, and the whole town wanted to celebrate with them. It was a small gathering, but a warm one. People Thomas barely knew came up to congratulate them, to wish them well, to welcome Emma to the community. For a woman who had arrived friendless and alone, Emma now had neighbors who clearly already cared about her. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for these good people. As the sun began to set, Thomas and Emma finally left White River and headed back to their homestead. They rode together in the wagon, Emma tucked against Thomas's side, both of them quiet with contentment. When they reached the cabin, Thomas lifted Emma down from the wagon and then, on impulse, scooped her up in his arms. "Thomas," Emma laughed. "What are you doing, carrying my wife over the threshold? It's tradition." He carried her into the cabin, which seemed to glow in the lamplight Emma had left burning. He set her down gently, and they stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. "Hello, Mrs. Nolan. Hello, Mr. Nolan." Emma reached up and touched his face. "Take me to bed, husband." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that left them both breathless and deeply connected. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Emma's head on Thomas's chest, his arms wrapped around her. "I never knew it could be like this," Emma whispered. "So right, so perfect." "Neither did I." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "But I'm going to spend every day of my life making you happy, Emma. That's my promise to you. You already make me happy just by being you." The first months of marriage were an adjustment, but a joyful one. Thomas and Emma learned each other's rhythms, how to work together efficiently, how to navigate the small disagreements that arose. Emma proved to be an excellent manager of their household, stretching their resources and making the cabin into a real home with curtains, rugs braided from scraps, and small touches of beauty wherever she could create them. Thomas finished the cabin's construction and began planning additional buildings. A proper barn, a chicken coop, maybe even a smokehouse. In September, Emma began to feel unwell in the mornings. At first, she thought it was something she had eaten, but when the queasiness persisted for a week, Thomas insisted they ride to White River to see the doctor. Dr. Morrison was an elderly man with gentle hands and a kind smile. After examining Emma, he congratulated them both. Emma was expecting a child due sometime in the spring. Thomas felt like he might faint from joy. A baby. They were going to have a baby. He held Emma's hand tightly as they left the doctor's office, both of them grinning like idiots. "Are you happy?" Emma asked, though she could clearly see he was. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. Thomas stopped right there in the middle of the street and kissed her, not caring who saw. "We're going to have a family, Emma. A real family." The months of Emma's pregnancy were precious to Thomas. He watched her body change, marveled at the way her belly grew round with their child. He became fiercely protective, not wanting her to do any heavy work, though Emma rolled her eyes at his hovering. She felt fine, she insisted, and she wasn't made of glass. Still, Thomas couldn't help himself. He built a cradle during the long winter evenings, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, wanting everything perfect for their baby. Winter in Wyoming was harsh, but they faced it together. Thomas had laid in plenty of supplies, and the cabin, now fully completed, was snug and warm. They spent evenings by the fire, Thomas reading aloud from the few books they owned while Emma knitted tiny clothes and blankets. Sometimes they just talked, making plans, dreaming about the future. Emma wrote letters to her sisters, telling them about her new life, about Thomas, about the baby coming. She sent money when she could spare it, saving toward the day when she could send for them. In March, Emma's time came. It was late at night, and Thomas woke to find Emma gripping his arm, her face tight with pain. "The baby," she said. "It's coming." Thomas's heart leapt into his throat. He rode through the darkness to fetch Mrs. Henley, who had agreed to serve as midwife. The older woman came immediately, calm and capable, and shooed Thomas out of the cabin while she tended to Emma. The hours that followed were the longest of Thomas's life. He paced outside, praying to a God he had mostly ignored since his parents died, making wild promises if only Emma and the baby would be all right. Inside, he could hear Emma crying out, and every sound tore at him. Just when he thought he couldn't bear it anymore, a new sound cut through the night. A baby's cry, strong and insistent. Mrs. Henley opened the door, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Nolan, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is tired but well. Come meet your child." Thomas entered the cabin on shaking legs. Emma lay in their bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket she had made. She looked up at him with such love and pride that Thomas felt tears spring to his eyes. He knelt beside the bed, and Emma shifted the blanket so he could see their son's face. He was perfect. Tiny and red-faced and perfect. "He's beautiful," Thomas whispered, touching the baby's impossibly small hand. The little fingers curled around one of his, gripping with surprising strength. "He's perfect, Emma. We should name him," Emma said softly. "I was thinking, if you approve, we could name him after your father." "What was his name?" Joseph Nolan." Thomas looked up at her, overwhelmed. "You do that. He's part of your father's legacy, just like he's part of us. Joseph Nolan." Emma smiled down at the baby. "Little Joey. Welcome to the world, my darling." Thomas had thought he knew what love was. He loved Emma with his whole heart, had thought that was the deepest feeling he could experience. But holding his son for the first time, feeling that tiny weight in his arms, he discovered a whole new dimension of love. This was his child, his and Emma's, a piece of both of them, the living embodiment of their love for each other. The early days with Joey were exhausting and wonderful. The baby needed constant care, and Emma bore the brunt of it, nursing him every few hours and sleeping in snatches between feedings. Thomas helped wherever he could, walking with Joey when he fussed, changing diapers, bringing Emma food and water. He had never been so tired in his life, but he had also never been so happy. This was what he had been building toward even when he didn't know it. This family, this love, this life. As spring turned to summer and Joey grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, smiling infant, Thomas and Emma settled into their new reality as parents. They worked together even more closely now, coordinating their efforts so that Joey was always cared for while the necessary work still got done. Thomas planted their largest garden yet, and Emma tended it while wearing Joey in a sling she had made. The baby seemed to love being outside, cooing at the birds and the clouds. In July, a letter arrived from Emma's sister, the oldest one, whose name was Margaret. She wrote that their father had died, drunk and broke, and that she and the younger sister, Catherine, were desperate to leave Ohio. Could they come to Wyoming? Emma cried when she read the letter, grief for the father who had failed her and relief that her sisters would be safe. Thomas immediately wrote back, sending money for train fare and telling them to come as soon as possible. Margaret and Catherine arrived in August. Thomas met them at the train station in Cheyenne, the nearest city with rail service, and drove them the long distance back to White River. The young women were tired and wary, but when they saw Emma waiting at the homestead, their faces transformed with joy. The reunion was tearful and beautiful, three sisters together again after too long apart. Margaret was 24 and practical, with the same dark hair as Emma but a more serious demeanor. Catherine was 20 and full of energy, curious about everything. Both of them fell in love with Joey immediately, cooing over him and fighting over who got to hold him. Thomas watched his wife with her sisters and felt his heart expand even more. This was what family should be: love and support and safety. The cabin, which had felt spacious for two and cozy for three, was now distinctly crowded with 5 people and a baby. Thomas immediately began work on an addition, building a separate room that would serve as a bedroom for Margaret and Catherine. The young women insisted on helping, and Thomas discovered that Margaret was quite handy with a hammer while Catherine had a gift for making things beautiful. Together, they completed the addition in a month. With 2 more pairs of hands to help, the homestead flourished. Margaret took over much of the cooking, freeing Emma to focus on Joey and the garden. Catherine proved to have a way with animals, and when Thomas brought home chickens, she tended them devotedly, naming each one despite Thomas's protests that they were livestock, not pets. The homestead, which Thomas had once envisioned as a lonely bachelor's claim, was now bustling with life and laughter. That winter, Margaret met a man named Samuel Porter, a rancher whose land adjoined theirs to the south. He was 30, soft-spoken and steady, and he courted Margaret with old-fashioned persistence. By spring, they were married, and Samuel built Margaret a small house on his property. She was close enough to visit daily, which she did, and the bond between the sisters remained strong. Catherine, meanwhile, had caught the eye of the schoolteacher in White River, a young man named David Foster who was 22 and earnest. Thomas liked him, appreciated the respectful way he treated Catherine, and when David asked for her hand that summer, Thomas gave his blessing gladly. Catherine and David married in the fall and moved into a small house in White River near the schoolhouse where David taught. Now Emma's sisters were settled and happy, and the relief on Emma's face was profound. She had saved them, given them a chance at good lives. Thomas was proud of her, proud of what they had built together. Joey was walking now, toddling around the cabin and yard with the fearless confidence of a child who knew he was loved. He had Thomas's dark hair and Emma's golden eyes, and he was the light of both their lives. Emma was expecting again, due in the winter, and Thomas found himself hoping for a daughter this time. A little girl with Emma's grace and strength. But healthy was all that truly mattered, he reminded himself. A healthy baby and a safe delivery for Emma. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah, arrived in January of 1878 during a snowstorm. This time, Thomas was calmer, more confident. He knew what to expect, and Mrs. Henley's presence was reassuring. When he finally held his daughter, so tiny and perfect, he marveled at the fact that he had helped create something so beautiful. Sarah had Emma's delicate features and a head full of dark hair. Joey, now almost 2, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her gently and bring her his toys. Life fell into a rhythm over the next few years. Thomas and Emma worked their land, raised their children, and built a legacy. Joey grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved helping his father with the animals and exploring the prairie. Sarah was quieter, more thoughtful, but with a stubborn streak that made both parents laugh. She was her mother's daughter, Emma said fondly. In 1880, Emma gave birth to another son whom they named Daniel. The cabin expanded again, rooms added as needed until it was a proper house, solid and comfortable. Thomas looked around sometimes and could hardly believe this was his life. The lonely cowboy building a cabin for one had become a husband, a father, a man surrounded by love. Emma, sitting on the porch with Sarah on her lap while the boys played in the yard, would catch his eye and smile, and Thomas knew she felt the same wonder. They had built this together, this life, this family, this future. The years brought challenges, of course. Harsh winters when supplies ran low. Dry summers when the creek nearly ran dry. Sickness that had them all worried, though thankfully nothing too serious. But they faced everything together, Thomas and Emma, partners in every sense. Margaret and Samuel had children of their own, and Catherine and David too. So Joey, Sarah, and Daniel grew up surrounded by cousins. The homestead was often full of family, full of noise and laughter and life. In 1885, on a warm summer evening, Thomas and Emma sat on their porch watching the sunset. The children were asleep inside, finally quiet after a long, busy day. Emma leaned against Thomas's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked. "Every detail. You fell right into my arms." "I did, and you caught me." Emma looked up at him, her eyes soft. "You've been catching me ever since." "You gave me a reason to catch you. Before you came, I was just going through motions, building a house, not a home. Working toward a future that didn't mean anything because I didn't have anyone to share it with." Thomas kissed her forehead. "You changed everything, Emma. You and our children, you're everything to me. We built a good life together, didn't we? The best life. Better than anything I could have imagined." Thomas thought about that lonely cowboy he had been, hammering nails into a half-built cabin, convinced that solitude was enough. How wrong he had been. How grateful he was that Emma's wagon had broken down on the trail near his land. "I love you, Emma Nolan. I will until the day I die." "I love you too, Thomas. Always." They sat together as the stars came out, the prairie spreading around them in all directions. Inside the house, their children slept safe and loved. Margaret and Catherine were settled with good men and families of their own. The homestead was prosperous, the future secure. Thomas had built all of this, but not alone. Never alone. Emma had been beside him every step of the way from that first moment when he caught her falling to this perfect evening. He had been building a future alone, and then she arrived and he built it for two. Now they had built something even bigger. A family. A legacy. A love that would endure. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. Joey grew into a young man who loved the land as much as his father did, and Thomas began teaching him everything he knew about ranching and farming. Sarah became a skilled seamstress and artist, her drawings and paintings decorating the walls of their home. Daniel was the dreamer of the family, always asking questions about the wider world, though Thomas suspected he would never stray far from home. In 1890, Thomas and Emma became grandparents for the first time when Joey married a local girl named Hannah and had a daughter they named Emma after her grandmother. Holding his granddaughter, seeing the tears of joy in Emma's eyes as she held her namesake, Thomas felt the circle complete. He was 52 now, Emma 45, and they had lived more life than he had ever dreamed possible. The cabin he had started building alone in 1876 was now a large, rambling house surrounded by barns, corrals, and fields. The land that had seemed so empty was now full of family, full of love. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Emma into White River for a special dinner at the hotel. The children were old enough to watch themselves for an evening, and Thomas wanted to celebrate properly. Over steak and potatoes, Emma raised her glass of wine and said, "To 20 years of marriage and to 50 more. I'll drink to that." Thomas clinked his glass against hers. "Though I don't know if I have 50 years left in me. Then we'll take whatever time we have and make it count." Emma's face was more lined now, her dark hair threaded with silver, but to Thomas, she was as beautiful as the day he had caught her falling from that wagon. More beautiful because now he knew her completely. Every thought, every dream, every fear. She was his partner, his love, his life. "Thank you, Thomas," Emma said softly, "for giving me a home, for giving me a family, for loving me. Thank you for staying, for choosing me, for building this life with me. I was half a man before you, Emma. You made me whole." They danced that night in the hotel ballroom, slow and close, ignoring the younger couples spinning around them. Thomas held Emma and thought about all the years behind them and all the years still to come. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it. This love, this partnership, this life. He had been building a future alone until Emma arrived, and then he had built it for two. But what they had created together was so much more than either of them could have managed alone. It was a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It was everything. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, Emma resting against Thomas's shoulder in the wagon, he thought about that young, lonely cowboy he had been. The man who thought he could build a life with just his own two hands and no one to share it with. How foolish that man had been. How incomplete. Everything that mattered, everything that made life worth living, had come from opening his heart to Emma. From catching her when she fell and never letting her go. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked, her voice drowsy and content. "Just how lucky I am, how grateful. Me too." Emma squeezed his hand. "Me too, my love." Thomas drove them home through the Wyoming night, past the land he had claimed and cultivated, toward the house they had built together. Inside, their children slept, and beyond them, their extended family carried on the legacy they had started. Thomas Nolan, who had once thought he would live and die alone, was surrounded by love. It had all started with one moment, one choice to help a stranger in need, and from that moment, Everything had changed. The house came into view, lamplight glowing in the windows. Home. Their home. Built not for one but for two, and expanded for the family they had created together. Thomas helped Emma down from the wagon and wrapped his arm around her waist as they walked to the door. Inside, the house was quiet, peaceful. They checked on each of their children, still young enough to be under their roof, kissing foreheads and adjusting blankets. Then they retired to their own room, the room they had shared for 20 years, and held each other close. "I love you, Emma Nolan," Thomas whispered into the darkness. "I love you, Thomas Nolan," Emma whispered back. And in the morning they would wake and face another day together, as they always had, as they always would, for as long as they both should live. The cowboy had been building a future alone until she arrived, and then he built it for two. But what they had created together was infinite, eternal, a love that would echo through generations. It was everything he had never known he needed, everything that mattered, everything that was good and true and worth fighting for. It was home, it was family, it was love. Years continued to unfold like the pages of a cherished book. In 1895, Sarah married a young doctor who had come to White River to establish a practice. His name was Robert Mitchell, and he was a kind, intelligent man who clearly adored Sarah. Thomas walked his daughter down the aisle of the small church in town, and when he handed her off to Robert, he felt the bittersweet pang of a father watching his little girl become a woman. But he also felt pride and joy, knowing that Sarah had found a good man who would cherish her the way Thomas cherished Emma. Daniel, true to his questioning nature, left home at 20 to travel east and attend university. Thomas and Emma missed him terribly, but they supported his dreams, just as their own dreams had been supported. He came home for holidays, full of stories about the wider world, and Thomas saw Emma's eyes light up with pride at the educated, thoughtful man their youngest son had become. Daniel promised he would return to Wyoming after his studies, that the land called to him even when he was far away. Thomas believed him. The prairie had a way of holding on to its own. Joey took over more and more of the ranch operations as Thomas aged, and father and son worked together seamlessly. Joey had inherited Thomas's steadiness and Emma's practical wisdom, and he was building his own legacy now, expanding the cattle operation and improving the land. His children, 3 in total now, ran wild and free across the homestead, reminding Thomas of his own childhood. So long ago it seemed like another lifetime. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Thomas and Emma hosted a massive family gathering. All their children were there, along with Emma's sisters and their families. The house and yard were full of people, 3 generations eating and laughing and celebrating. Thomas stood on his porch, watching it all, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. Joey was teaching his eldest son how to rope a fence post. Sarah sat with her children, reading them a story. Daniel, home from university for the summer, was engaged in animated conversation with Samuel and David. And Emma, his beautiful Emma, was in the center of it all, holding a grandchild on each hip, her face radiant with joy. Margaret came to stand beside Thomas, following his gaze. "You two built something remarkable," she said quietly. "When Catherine and I came here all those years ago, scared and uncertain, you welcomed us without hesitation. You gave us safety and family. I never thanked you properly for that. No thanks needed. You're Emma's sisters. That makes you my family too." Thomas smiled at her. "Besides, you've all contributed to making this place what it is. It's not just me and Emma, it's all of us. Still, you started it. You and Emma." Margaret squeezed his arm. "I hope you know how loved you are, Thomas." He did know. How could he not, surrounded by all this evidence? Thomas watched Emma catch his eye across the yard, watched her smile at him, that same smile that had captured his heart so many years ago. He smiled back, a whole conversation passing between them in that look. "We did it," that look said. "We built this. We loved and were loved. We succeeded." That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Thomas and Emma sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Emma's hair was mostly silver now, and Thomas's hands were gnarled with age and work. But their love had only deepened, aged like fine wine into something rich and profound. "We're getting old," Emma observed, not sadly, just as a statement of fact. "We are," Thomas agreed. "But we're getting old together, that's all that matters." "Do you have any regrets, Thomas? Anything you wish you had done differently?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "No," he said finally. "Not a single one. My only regret would have been if I hadn't stopped to help you that day, if I had let you pass by. Everything good in my life came from that choice. Everything good in my life came from your kindness that day, too. You saved me, Thomas, not just physically, but in every way a person can be saved. You gave me love and safety and a family. You gave me a life worth living." Emma took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "If I could go back and live my life again, I wouldn't change a single thing. Every joy, every sorrow, every moment led me to you and this life we built. Emma, I need you to know something." Thomas turned to face her, serious now. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, the very best. And whatever time we have left, whether it's 50 more years or 5 more minutes, I want to spend it exactly like this. With you, surrounded by the family we created on the land we built together. This is heaven to me, this right here." "It's heaven to me too," Emma whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "I love you so much, Thomas Nolan, more than words can express." "I love you too, Emma, always and forever." They sat together until the stars came out, until the night grew cool and they finally went inside to their bed. And in the morning, they woke up together, as they had for over 2 decades, and faced another day as partners. The cowboy who had been building a future alone had long since disappeared, replaced by a man who understood that the best things in life were built together, with love and patience and commitment. Thomas Nolan was a husband, a father, a grandfather, and a builder of legacies. But most importantly, he was loved, and that made all the difference. The years that followed were gentle, peaceful. Thomas and Emma aged gracefully, their love sustaining them through the aches and pains of growing older. They watched their grandchildren grow, celebrated more weddings, welcomed more great-grandchildren. The ranch continued to prosper under Joey's management, and Thomas was content to step back and let the younger generation take over. He had built the foundation. Now it was up to them to build upon it. In 1910, on a warm spring morning much like the one when they had first met, Thomas and Emma sat on their porch drinking coffee. The prairie spread before them, green and alive with new growth. Thomas was 62 now, Emma 55, and they both felt their years. But they also felt blessed, grateful for every day they had together. Emma leaned against Thomas's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. "It's been a good life," Emma said softly. "The best life," Thomas agreed. "Everything I ever wanted and more than I knew to dream of. Do you remember what you told me that first week when I was still recovering? You said I made you realize how empty your future felt when you were building it alone. I remember. It was true. I felt the same way. I thought I was running toward freedom, but really, I was just running away from unhappiness. I had no real destination, no real plan. And then you caught me, and suddenly I had a purpose, a home, a future worth building." Emma looked up at him, her eyes still as beautiful as they had been at 25. You gave me everything, Thomas. We gave each other everything. Thomas kissed her forehead. That's how it works. Two people building something together, something neither could build alone. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day unfold. In the distance, they could see Joey working with his sons, teaching them the way Thomas had taught him. The cycle continued, generation to generation, love building upon love. Thomas thought about that lonely young man he had been, hammering away at a cabin, convinced he needed nothing but his own determination. How wrong he had been. How grateful he was to have been proven wrong. "Thank you, Emma," Thomas said, breaking the silence, "for staying that day when you could have left, for loving me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for catching me," Emma replied, smiling, "in every way possible." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas and Emma remained on their porch, hand in hand, heart to heart. They had faced down the prairie together, built a home and a family and a legacy. They had known joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, but through it all, they had had each other. That was the secret, Thomas thought. That was the key to everything. Love, partnership, the willingness to build not for yourself but for each other, for the future you would share. He had been building a future alone until she arrived, and then he had built it for two. But what they had created together was so much more than two. It was a family that stretched across generations, a love story that would be told and retold, a legacy that would endure long after they were both gone. It was everything that mattered. Everything that was true and good and worth living for. Thomas Nolan looked at his wife, his partner, his great love, and felt complete. This was the life he had been meant to live. This was the future he had been meant to build. Not alone, never alone, but with Emma by his side. Together, they had created something beautiful. Together, they had created a home. And that, Thomas thought, was the greatest accomplishment of all.